The Graveyard Whispers. The town of Hollow Creek had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and secrets rarely lasted long. But there was one place that stood in the shadows of whispers, the old pet cemetery, hidden deep within Blackwood Forest. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning children never to step beyond the rusted iron gate that guarded the overgrown graves. No one knew exactly how old it was, only that pets had been buried there for generations. But some claimed that not everything that was buried stayed buried. A family's new beginning. The Bennett family moved to Hollow Creek just before autumn set in. Daniel Bennett, a history professor, had accepted a job at the local university, and his wife Emily was eager for a fresh start away from the city. Their son, Owen, was only 10, but had a natural curiosity that often led him into trouble. Their family dog, a golden retriever named Max, had been with Owen since birth, the two inseparable. The new house sat on the outskirts of town, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough that the woods pressed close to the backyard. It was a beautiful house with its wraparound porch and old oak trees swaying in the autumn wind. But there was something off. From the very first night, Owen swore he heard strange noises in the woods. Scratching, whispers. His parents dismissed it as the wind, the rustling of dry leaves. But Max? He would sit at the back door, ears perked, growling low into the darkness. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Owen rode his bike farther than he should have. He had heard about the pet cemetery from kids at school. They dared him to find it. Just past the old sawmill, they said, but don't go up the hill. The first visit. It didn't take long for Owen to find the overgrown path leading into the woods. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own breath. Then suddenly, there it was. A rusted iron gate, twisted and leaning with age. Beyond it, rows of small headstones, some barely visible under vines and moss. Owen's heart pounded as he stepped through. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the ground itself held secrets. The names on the stones were faded, but he could make out some shadow, beloved friend. Mittens, always in our hearts. Then he saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, a narrow path led up a hill, the trees closing in around it. The path was different. The ground was darker, the air colder. A strange smell drifted from beyond the trees, like damp earth mixed with something rotten. Owen took a step forward. A whisper curled through the trees. Not the wind, not an animal, a voice. Don't. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The voice was right next to him, but no one was there. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the trees. Something moved. Something big. Owen turned and ran. He didn't stop until he burst through the back door of his house, panting, face pale. His mother looked up from the sink, concerned. "Owen?" "What's wrong?" He wanted to tell her. About the cemetery, the whisper, the thing in the trees. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, Max pressed against his leg, ears low, whining softly. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere, deep in the woods, something laughed. The Graveyard Whispers. The night after Owen's visit to the pet cemetery, sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hill, the darkened path curling into the woods, and he heard the whisper. Close, too close. Don't. Max refused to leave his side. The dog usually slept at the foot of the bed, but that night he curled up right next to Owen, his warm body pressed against the boy's ribs. Every so often, Max's ears would twitch, his head jerking up at some sound only he could hear. Owen tried to tell himself it was just the wind, but when the scratching started at his window, he stopped pretending. A slow, deliberate scrape, then another. Owen held his breath, heart pounding. His bedroom was on the second floor. There shouldn't be anything outside that window. Max growled, low and deep. The sound vibrated against Owen's chest. He reached for his flashlight, his hands trembling. The scratching stopped the moment he turned it on. He swallowed hard and forced himself to look. The window was empty. Just the night sky, the silhouette of trees swaying in the breeze. Nothing there. And yet, something felt wrong. For the rest of the night, Owen stayed awake, listening. He never heard the scratching again, but sleep never found him either. A family in mourning. The next morning, Owen didn't tell his parents about what happened. They wouldn't believe him. He was just a kid, and parents never listened when you told them something wasn't right. But Max knew. The dog stayed by his side all through breakfast, his tail low, his nose twitching as if sniffing some unseen presence in the air. Even when Owen left for school, Max stood by the front door watching. That afternoon, Owen's mother called him as soon as he stepped off the bus. He could tell by her voice that something was wrong. When he got home, his father was standing on the porch, his face pale, his hands clenched. And Max was gone. Owen felt like the air had been knocked from his chest. "We don't know what happened," his mother said, rubbing his back as he sat frozen at the kitchen table. "The back door was open this morning. He must have run off into the woods." "But he wouldn't do that," Owen protested. His voice cracked. "Max never ran away. Never." His father sighed, rubbing his eyes. "We looked everywhere, bud. We'll keep searching." Owen knew they wouldn't find him, because Owen knew where he was. The return to the cemetery. That night, Owen couldn't take it anymore. His parents were asleep. The house was quiet, but the weight in his chest was unbearable. Max was in the woods, and he was calling. Not out loud, no barking, no howling. But Owen felt it, a pull deep in his bones. So he crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The back door was unlocked, swinging open just slightly, as if someone had already been through it. He stepped outside. The night air was cold, colder than it should have been for October. The wind carried a smell, wet earth, rotting leaves, something else, something bitter. Owen moved quickly, his feet silent on the dirt path. He didn't need a flashlight. The full moon bathed everything in silver light. He didn't think about the shadows stretching through the trees, the way they seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. All he thought about was Max. And then, there it was. The rusted gate, looming in the darkness. He hesitated only for a moment before pushing it open. The graveyard was silent, the tombstones standing like forgotten teeth in the overgrown grass. The whisper of the wind curled between them, carrying that same eerie hush, that feeling of watching eyes. Owen stepped carefully, scanning the graves. Then he saw it. A disturbed patch of earth, fresh and uneven, at the very edge of the cemetery. The dirt looked wrong, like it had been shoveled hastily, like something had been buried recently. Owen's stomach twisted, and then, a sound, a low, muffled whimper. His breath hitched, his whole body tensed. It was coming from beneath the dirt. Owen's hands moved before his brain could stop him. He dug, shoving the loose earth aside, his fingers scraping against the cold, damp ground. He didn't care about the worms, the smell of decay. He dug deeper and deeper until his hand touched something soft. Fur. Owen's heart nearly stopped. He pulled harder, and then Max's head emerged from the dirt. His golden fur was matted with mud, his eyes closed. He was cold, too cold. Owen's vision blurred, his throat burned. No. Max was dead. He let out a sob, fingers shaking as he wiped the dirt from his dog's face. He had failed him. He was too late. Then, Max's eyes opened, and they weren't the eyes of the dog Owen had always known. They were black, empty. And Max smiled. A twisted, unnatural grin, his lips curling back to reveal teeth that looked too sharp. Owen gasped, stumbling backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then Max moved. Not like a dog waking up. Not naturally. His limbs jerked, his head twisted at an odd angle, his body twitching as if he were being puppeteered by invisible hands. A low, guttural growl bubbled up from his throat. Owen ran. Behind him he could hear scratching, clawing, the sound of something chasing him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As he burst through the cemetery gate, the air around him shifted. The whispering started again, curling around his ears like smoke. You brought him back. Owen's vision swam. He felt like he was going to be sick. He ran all the way home, slammed the door behind him, locked it. His chest heaved, his skin ice cold. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The night was still. Then, a scratching sound at the back door. Slow, deliberate. Owen pressed a shaking hand over his mouth to keep from screaming, and then, a voice. "Let me in," the graveyard whispers. The scratching at the back door wouldn't stop. Slow, deliberate, claw against wood. Owen stood frozen in the middle of the darkened kitchen, his breath locked in his throat. His legs screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Then came the voice. "Let me in, Owen." It wasn't Max's voice. Not really. It was too slow, too distorted, like someone struggling to form words with a mouth that wasn't meant for speech. It was Max's tone, but not his soul. Owen's stomach twisted. Outside, the scratching stopped. Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. No whispering wind, no shifting leaves, just the dead of night pressing against the house. And then, a single thud against the door. A weight, heavy and unmoving, pressing against the wood. Owen bolted. He tore through the kitchen, up the stairs, nearly tripping in his panic. He slammed the bedroom door shut behind him, heart hammering so violently he thought it might explode. He curled under his blankets, eyes squeezed shut, hands over his ears. For hours, he lay there, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No more scratching. No voice. Eventually, exhaustion took him, pulling him into restless, nightmare-ridden sleep. The tracks in the dirt. The next morning, Owen was too afraid to go downstairs. What if it was still there? What if it was waiting? But when he finally gathered the courage to peek out his window, he saw nothing. The yard was empty. Had he imagined it? Had it all been some fever dream brought on by grief? Swallowing hard, Owen crept downstairs. The house was eerily normal. Sunlight filtered through the windows. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and his parents were moving about as if nothing had happened. Had they heard anything last night? Did they just not notice? Slowly, cautiously, Owen approached the back door. The wood was unmarked. No scratches, no dents, nothing. His stomach twisted. But when he opened it and stepped outside, the breath was punched from his lungs. The yard was covered in tracks, not paw prints, something else. They started at the tree line and led straight to the back door. Deep impressions, like something dragged itself across the dirt. Owen's mouth went dry. He knew what it meant. Max, or the thing that had been Max, had been here. And it hadn't just waited outside. It had tried to get in. The warnings Owen didn't go to school that day. He couldn't. He needed to understand what was happening. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went back to the cemetery. He knew it was a terrible idea. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stay away. But he had no choice. He had to know. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it open. The graves sat in their silent rows untouched. But the disturbed patch of earth where Max had been buried looked different now. The dirt was still loose. But something was wrong. A hole had opened in the center, like a tunnel leading deeper than it should. Owen felt his stomach churn. He didn't dare look any closer. Instead, he turned his eyes to the hill. The path leading up was clearer than before, as if something had been using it. The trees at the top seemed too still, the air around them too quiet. And then he heard it. A whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." Owen whirled around, his blood turning to ice. Standing between the gravestones was a man. No, not a man. His skin was gray, stretched thin over sharp bones. His eyes were sunken pits of darkness. His clothes hung in tattered shreds, covered in dried mud. Owen stumbled back, his heart thundering. Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, its neck cracking like dry wood. "You brought it back, you opened the door." Owen shook his head. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted my dog." The figure stepped closer, and suddenly, Owen couldn't breathe. The air around him grew thick, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. "Not everything that dies should stay dead," the figure rasped. "Now it knows, and it won't stop." Owen's skin crawled. "What won't stop?" he whispered. The figure's lips curled into something that was not a smile. "The thing in your house." Owen felt his heart drop. Before he could move, before he could think, the figure vanished, fading into the mist like he had never been there at all. A gust of wind rustled the trees, carrying something with it. A sound, a growl, low, hungry, and it was coming from behind him. Owen didn't look back. He ran. The thing in the house. By the time Owen reached home, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The house stood quiet, normal, but Owen knew better. Something was wrong. He stepped inside, the air thick and still. His parents were nowhere to be seen. The kitchen light flickered, and then the smell hit him. Rotting meat, damp fur, decay. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. A low creaking sound came from the hallway. Owen turned his head, slowly, carefully, toward the darkened corridor leading to his bedroom. And his stomach dropped. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the shadows, something stood. Something wrong. It had Max's shape, the outline of a dog, head tilted, tail low. But its eyes were wrong. They were empty, soulless, black pits, and its mouth was open, too wide, unnaturally wide. Max's jaw unhinged, stretching further and further, revealing row after row of jagged teeth. A deep, inhuman clicking sound came from its throat. Owen felt his muscles lock, his breath hitching. The thing lurched forward. Owen screamed. The last thing he saw before he turned to run was Max's too wide grin, and the way his body twitched as if something else was moving inside his skin. The graveyard whispers. Owen tore through the house, his pulse hammering so hard it drowned out all other sound. Behind him, the thing that looked like Max followed, its claws clicking against the hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate, like it knew he had nowhere to go. Owen rounded the corner, heart slamming against his ribs. He needed to get upstairs, lock himself in his room, think. But just as he reached the base of the staircase, the floor creaked behind him. Too close. A breath, hot, rotten, wet, ghosted over his neck. Owen lunged forward, barely dodging as something swiped at him. His hand slammed against the staircase railing, the wooden frame shaking as he scrambled upward 2 steps at a time. A snarl erupted from behind, and then a crash. The thing slammed into the wall, knocking over a side table, sending a lamp shattering onto the floor. Owen didn't look back. He dove into his room, yanked the door shut, and locked it. A second later, something hit the wood from the other side. Boom. Owen stumbled backward. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming. Another thud. Then, silence. The only thing Owen could hear was the rush of blood in his ears, and then, "Owen?" His stomach twisted. That voice. It was Max's voice. But it wasn't. "Owen, it's me. Let me in." Number. No, no, no. Owen clenched his fists, squeezing his eyes shut. It wasn't real. Max was dead. The thing outside his door wasn't him. And then, in a voice so soft, so painfully familiar, it said, "I don't want to be out here anymore." Owen's breath caught. A lump formed in his throat. Number, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then, the voice changed. The softness dropped away. twisting into something that didn't belong in this world. "You shouldn't have dug me up." Owen's knees buckled. The door handle rattled violently, the knob twisting back and forth faster and faster. Then, silence. Owen held his breath. Slowly, he reached out, hands trembling, and pressed his palm against the door. Nothing. Was it gone? Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, from the other side of the door, just inches from his face, a whisper. "You let me in once. You'll let me in again." Owen yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. The thing on the other side laughed. Then the floor creaked. The clicking of claws moved away, and the house fell completely silent. The warning in the woods. Owen didn't sleep. He spent the entire night sitting in the corner of his room, watching the door, waiting for the handle to turn again. But it never did. By morning, the house was eerily normal. His parents acted like nothing had happened. His father drank coffee and read the paper. His mother hummed while making breakfast. They hadn't heard it. They hadn't seen it. Owen's hands shook as he picked at his cereal. He didn't know how to explain it to them. They wouldn't believe him. And if they did, what would they do? They couldn't call the cops. "Hello, officer. My dead dog came back wrong and tried to kill me." No one would believe him. So he made a decision. He had to fix this himself. He had to go back to the cemetery. To the hill. The forbidden hill. Owen waited until the afternoon, until his parents were busy, then slipped out the back door. The woods were colder than before. The trees didn't move in the wind. Even the birds were silent. He pushed forward, forcing his legs to keep going even as his instincts screamed at him to turn back. Then, he saw it. The pet cemetery. The grave stood unchanged, the iron gate still slightly ajar. But something was different. The hill. It was taller. The path leading up was clearer now, as if something had been using it. A pit of dread opened in Owen's stomach. He had always been told not to go up the hill, but he didn't have a choice anymore. He started climbing. With each step, the air grew thicker. The trees bent toward him, their branches curling like twisted fingers. The top of the hill was flat, covered in dark, loose soil. And in the center, a circle of stones, blackened, burned. Owen's breath came out in short, uneven bursts. Something about this place was wrong. The ground beneath his feet felt hungry, like it had been waiting. Then, a sound, a rustling in the trees. Owen whipped around, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Max. His fur hung in loose, damp clumps. His mouth was slightly open, that twisted, unnatural grin still there. But now, Owen could see something inside his mouth. A second set of teeth. Smaller. Human. Owen's entire body locked up. His mind screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Then slowly, so horribly slowly, Max tilted his head, and from deep within his chest, something else spoke. "You should have let me sleep." Owen's breath hitched. His knees nearly buckled. Then Max lunged. Owen ran. Down the hill through the trees, branches tearing at his arms and legs. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear it. The clicking of claws, the sound of something wet and unnatural moving too fast behind him. Then, the whispering started again. From all around him, from the trees, the ground, the air. "You let it in. You let it in. You let it in." Owen's lungs burned. He could see his house in the distance. He could almost make it. Then something grabbed his ankle. A hand, not an animal's. A human hand, thin, gray, bony fingers curling around his leg. Owen screamed. He kicked, scrambled, tore himself free, and stumbled forward. The thing let out a howl, not a bark, not a snarl. Something else. Something that wasn't from this world. Owen didn't stop running until he burst through the back door of his house, slammed it shut, and collapsed to the floor. His whole body shook. His breath came in sharp gasps. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees. And then, A single slow scratch against the door, a pause, then the voice. "You can't keep me out forever." Owen pressed his hands over his ears, and for the first time since this nightmare started, he realized he didn't know if it was talking about the house or his mind. The graveyard whispers. Owen sat on the cold kitchen floor, his back against the door, hands clamped over his ears. His heart pounded so violently it hurt. Outside, something waited. It hadn't knocked again. It hadn't scratched. But it was there. He could feel it. Watching. Waiting. A breeze snaked through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of rotting leaves, damp fur, and something sickly sweet, like meat left out in the sun too long. And then, "You have to let me in, Owen." The voice slithered through the wood, too soft, too wrong. "I'm cold." Owen clenched his jaw, squeezing his eyes shut. No. It wasn't Max. It had never been Max. Max was dead. But this thing, whatever it was, it wanted him to forget that. And for a second, he almost had. A desperate search for answers. Owen didn't know how long he sat there, curled against the door, listening to the silence. He was afraid to move, afraid that if he made a sound it would know he was still listening. He didn't know what to do. His parents wouldn't believe him, and even if they did, what could they do? No one could call the cops on something not alive. He had to figure this out himself. And that meant one thing: the library. He didn't trust the internet. Not for this. This wasn't something Google could explain, but an old town like Hollow Creek? A place with a pet cemetery older than anyone could remember. Someone had to have written about it. The whispering stacks. The Hollow Creek library was empty when Owen arrived. It smelled of dust, paper, and something stale, like old wood and forgotten secrets. The librarian, a frail old woman with clouded eyes, barely looked up when he slipped past the front desk. Owen made his way to the local history section, scanning the rows of brittle yellowed pages. Then he saw it. A thin black book, wedged between two massive tomes. There was no title on the spine, no author's name. The cover was smooth, worn leather, the kind that looked older than the town itself. Owen pulled it free, and as soon as his fingers touched the cover, a whisper slid through his ears. "You shouldn't have come here." Owen's breath hitched. He spun around, heart slamming. No one was there, just rows of books, stretching into shadowed silence. His hands trembled as he opened the book. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, no typed words, just scrawled warnings. His eyes scanned the first few pages, and then he found it. The hill. "The land beyond the graves is cursed. The soil is not meant for the dead. It is meant for something else. Something hungry." Owen swallowed hard and flipped the page. "Those buried there do not return alone. They are doorways." A shiver crawled up his spine. He turned another page. The handwriting grew messier, frantic, like the person had been writing in terror. "If you hear them speak, it is already too late." Owen's fingers went cold. A low breath ghosted over his ear. "Why are you reading about me?" Owen froze. His pulse stopped. That voice. It was right next to him. Slowly, so painfully slowly, Owen turned his head. At first he thought no one was there, but then the bookshelves at the far end of the aisle shifted. A figure stood between the rows, tall, thin, too thin. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its lips pulled back into a too wide smile, showing too many teeth. And its eyes, black pits, hungry, watching. Owen's breath caught in his throat. The thing took a step forward. And then, the librarian coughed from the front desk. The sound broke the spell. Owen snapped the book shut, his hands shaking. When he looked back, the figure was gone. But the whisper remained. You can't close the door once it's open. The truth about the hill. Owen sprinted home, the book clutched in his arms like a lifeline. The sun was already sinking by the time he burst through the door, heart still hammering. He locked it behind him, breath ragged. His parents weren't home yet. Good. He needed time. Time to understand what he'd done. He dropped the book onto the kitchen table and flipped to the last page. His eyes widened. There was an illustration. A crude, jagged drawing of a circle of blackened stones on a hilltop, the same one he had seen. Beneath it, written in sharp, erratic slashes, were the final words. A body buried in the cursed earth is not alone when it returns. It is only the beginning. Owen's blood ran cold. His fingers tightened around the book. His breath came too fast, too shallow. Max, or the thing pretending to be Max, was not the end of this. He had let something else out, and it was still hungry. Then, click. The kitchen light flickered, the air in the house changed. Owen's stomach twisted into knots. Something was here, something was watching, and then, a voice from the hallway. Software crooked. Why did you bring me back, Owen? The thing in the dark. Owen's hands went clammy. He turned his head toward the hallway, pulse hammering. The kitchen light flickered again, dimming. And there, just beyond the doorway, a shadow moved. Not a normal shadow. It stretched, twisted. For a split second, Owen saw a shape, too tall, too thin, its limbs wrong, its mouth a black, gaping wound stretching too far down its face. It took a step closer. Owen scrambled backward, knocking over the chair. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. He shouldn't have dug up Max. He shouldn't have stepped onto the hill. Now something else was here, and it wasn't just waiting outside anymore. It was already inside. The last thing Owen heard before the lights went out completely was laughter. Not human, not animal. Something in between. Something starving. The graveyard whispers. Darkness swallowed the kitchen. Owen's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every sound except for one. The laughter. It wasn't normal. It clicked and rattled, a choked, gurgling sound, like something laughing with a throat full of mud and broken glass. It didn't belong in this world. Owen's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, a whisper from somewhere in the blackness. You let me in, Owen. His stomach lurched. A wet footstep hit the floor just beyond the kitchen doorway. Then another, slow, deliberate. Owen's shaking fingers scrambled across the kitchen counter, searching. Anything. His hand closed around a knife. He gripped it tight, his knuckles white. Then for a split second, the light from the street lamp outside flickered through the window, and Owen saw it, standing in the doorway. Maximum, but not Max. Its body twitched, its legs bending at unnatural angles. Its fur hung in damp, matted clumps, and its skin bulged in the wrong places, like something else was wearing it, like a suit that didn't fit. And its mouth. Oh God. It was too wide. A gaping, yawning grin stretching back far past where a normal jaw should end. Its teeth, rows and rows of them, gleamed in the dim light. Then, it spoke. Why won't you hug me, Owen? Owen threw the knife. It sailed through the air, and the thing didn't move. The blade sank deep into its shoulder, but there was no reaction, no yelp, no twitch of pain. Instead, it laughed again. The sound was wet, bubbling, wrong. Owen's chest seized. Run, run, run. He turned and bolted. Through the kitchen, up the stairs, his feet barely touching the ground. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But he heard it. The clicking claws on the tile. Then on the wooden stairs. It was following him. And it wasn't running. It was walking. Like it knew he had nowhere to go. The rot in the walls. Owen slammed the bedroom door shut, locked it, and stumbled backward until he hit the far wall. His chest heaved, his hands slick with sweat. Then, silence. He waited, listening. Nothing. Had it gone? Then, tap. Owen's stomach plummeted. The sound hadn't come from the door. It had come from the closet. Tap. His breath hitched, his whole body locked up. He turned his head slowly, painfully slowly, toward the closet door. It was open, just slightly. It had been closed before. Owen felt something shift in the darkness inside it. A whisper, curling out like smoke. "I was always here, Owen." Then, the closet door burst open. Something lurched out. Long arms, too thin, too gray, fingers like curling roots, reaching for him. Owen screamed. He dove for the window, yanking it open, climbing onto the roof, scrambling down the side of the house. His feet hit the ground and he ran. He didn't stop, not until he reached the one place he swore he'd never go back to. The pet cemetery. The thing beneath the hill. The cemetery was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the whisper of insects. Just dead. Heavy air. Owen stood at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the blackened stones. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. The thing that had worn Max's face had followed him home, and now it was inside the house. But why? Why had it come back wrong? His mind screamed the answer before he could stop it. Because I buried him here. Because the book had said, "A body buried in the cursed earth is not alone when it returns." Owen swallowed hard. There was only one thing left to do. He had to put Max back, for good. His legs shook as he climbed the hill, each step feeling like he was walking into his own grave. The air grew colder. A thick, rotting stench curled around him. And then, the ground moved. Owen froze. The dirt beneath his feet shifted. Then, a hand burst out of the soil, long, thin, human, not an animal's, not Max's, something else. Owen choked on a scream. The fingers twitched, curling into the dirt. Then, a second hand. Then something pulled itself up. A face, half-rotted, eyes nothing but hollow, hungry pits. Owen staggered backward. The thing's mouth opened, wider, wider, wider. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that had been waiting beneath the hill for a long, long time. And Owen had set it free. The end begins. The thing lunged for him. Owen turned and ran. But the hill had changed. The trees were wrong. The path was gone. The ground swallowed his footprints. And somewhere, deep in the forest, something laughed. Not Max, not the thing that had been wearing Max. Something bigger, older, something that had been waiting beneath the hill for someone foolish enough to open the door. And Owen had let it in. The graveyard whispers. The ground shifted beneath Owen's feet. The hilltop trembled, loose dirt crumbling away as the thing pulled itself free. Owen couldn't move, couldn't think. All he could do was watch as two thin fingers clawed at the earth, dragging a body half-decayed, half-formed into the moonlight. It wasn't human. Not fully. Its face, half-rotted, half-shifting, like something still deciding what it wanted to be. Its mouth too wide, its limbs too long, its skin rippling as if something was moving underneath. And its eyes, they were holes. Deep, yawning pits of nothing. Owen's stomach twisted. His body screamed at him to run, to move, to do anything but stand there. Then it spoke, but not with its mouth, with the ground itself. A whisper rose from the dirt, curling around Owen like cold fingers brushing his neck. "You open the door." Owen stumbled backward, shaking his head, breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only wanted Max back. That was all. He hadn't meant to wake something else up. The thing tilted its head, watching him. The motion was wrong, too smooth, like it wasn't moving its bones, but rather the air around them. Then, it stepped forward. Owen's body reacted before his brain could. He turned and ran. The forest that wouldn't let him leave the trees closed in too fast. The path that had once led down the hill was gone. In its place, more trees. Their trunks twisted, growing closer, taller, swallowing the sky. Owen's breath hitched. His feet pounded against the dirt, lungs burning. He didn't know where he was running anymore, but he could hear it behind him. The thing wasn't running. It didn't have to. The forest was moving with it. Branches reached for Owen, their tips curling like fingers, their bark splitting into gaping, jagged mouths. The whispers grew louder. "You let me in. You let me in. You let me in." Owen tripped. He hit the ground hard, knees scraping against jagged roots. His vision swam. A shadow moved above him. Owen's pulse stopped. The thing was there, towering over him. Close enough to touch. Its mouth opened wider, too wide, its face stretching like melting wax. Something inside that black, endless void of a mouth moved. Owen tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, something grabbed him from behind. A hand, cold, thin, but human. Owen barely had time to register it before he was yanked backward. The world tilted, the forest vanished, and then, everything was dark. The stranger in the dark. Owen hit the ground, gasping. His hands sank into soft dirt. The smell of rot and damp earth filled his nose. For a second, he thought he was buried alive. Then, a voice. "Get up, kid." Owen's eyes flew open. A figure stood over him, half-shadowed in the darkness. A man, thin, old, but not frail. His clothes were dirty, his face lined with deep creases. His eyes were sharp, but tired. Owen blinked. His voice wouldn't work. The man didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed Owen's wrist, yanked him to his feet, and started running. Owen stumbled after him, his legs barely working. His brain screamed with questions. Who was this? How had he pulled Owen out? Where were they? But before he could ask, a sound rippled through the ground. A groan. Not from the air, from the earth itself. The man swore under his breath. "It knows you're here." Owen's pulse slammed. He yanked his arm free. "What is it? What did I wake up?" The man stopped. He turned slowly, his expression grim. Something that should have stayed buried. Owen swallowed hard. "But what is it?" The man's jaw tensed. Then, a mistake. The truth about the hill. Owen and the man crouched low behind a fallen tree. The forest was still, but not silent. A deep breathing sound filled the air. Slow, measured, like something was searching. The man exhaled. "Tell me what happened. From the start." Owen's breath was shaky. He told him everything. Max, the pet cemetery, the whispers, the thing in his house. When he was done, the man didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, "You shouldn't have buried him on the hill." Owen's stomach twisted. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't." The man's tone was sharp. "No one does. That's how it works." Owen's fingers dug into the bark. "What is it?" The man's gaze darkened. "The hill is a door. It doesn't just take the dead. It takes whatever else is waiting on the other side." Owen's chest tightened. "You buried your dog in cursed earth, kid, and when he came back, he wasn't alone." Owen's breath hitched. His mind raced. The whisper in the house, the figure in the library, the thing in the dark. Max had come back, but something else had come through with him. And now, it was here, hunting him. Owen's hands clenched into fists. "How do we stop it?" The man exhaled slowly. His eyes flickered to the trees. "We don't." A branch snapped in the distance. The whispers started again. "We run." And then, the forest moved. The graveyard whispers. The forest shifted around them. Branches curled like fingers, stretching toward Owen and the stranger. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of damp rot, dead leaves, and something sickly sweet. And beneath it all, the whispering, "You let me in. You let me in. You let me in." Owen's chest clenched. He wanted to run, but the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. It pulsed, like the earth itself was breathing. The old man grabbed Owen's wrist. Move. Owen hesitated only for a second, then they ran. The thing in the fog. They tore through the trees, the whispering growing louder, deeper, hungry. Owen's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't stop. Because behind them, something was following. Not footsteps, something else. The air shuddered. The sky above them flickered, as if the world itself was struggling to hold together. Then, a sound, a long, slow scrape, like claws against bone. Owen risked a glance back, and immediately regretted it. The trees weren't trees anymore. Their bark peeled back, revealing something wet and pulsing underneath. Their branches stretched, curling into grinning, gaping mouths. And beyond them, a shape, tall, thin, wrong. Its limbs moved like they weren't attached to bones. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were just holes. And its mouth, oh God, it wasn't a mouth at all. It was a doorway, a gaping, yawning abyss opening wider, wider, as if the entire night was spilling out of it. The whispering grew deafening. Owen. The voice was Max's, but it wasn't Max. Owen's stomach lurched. The man grabbed him again. Don't listen. Then, the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, choking. It swallowed the trees, the sky, the world, and in that instant, the forest was gone. The house that wasn't there. Owen staggered forward, coughing. The fog was everywhere, curling around his arms, his legs, his throat. Then, suddenly, a shape appeared through the mist. A house. His house. But it wasn't right. The front door hung open. The windows were dark, empty, and in the doorway, a figure stood waiting. Not Max, not the thing from the woods. Someone else, someone familiar. Owen's breath caught. His father, standing still. Too still. Owen, his dad called softly. Owen's legs locked up. His father took a step forward and his foot didn't make a sound. Then, Owen saw it. His dad's shadow. It didn't match him. It was too tall, too thin, and it was moving on its own. Come inside, son. Owen felt his stomach drop. His dad smiled. A slow, unnatural stretch of lips, too wide, too wrong. Then his jaw unhinged, just like Max's, just like the thing in the woods. Owen's pulse snapped. Run! The old man yelled. But it was too late. The house lurched forward. Not the man inside it, the house itself. The windows became eyes. The door became a mouth, and it was hungry. The house that wanted to swallow him whole. Owen turned to run. But the ground vanished beneath his feet. He was falling into the house, into the mouth. The darkness swallowed him whole, and then everything went still. The other side. When Owen opened his eyes, he wasn't in Hollow Creek anymore. He wasn't anywhere. The world was black, not just dark, empty. Shapes twisted in the distance, shifting, moving, writhing, and standing in front of him was Max, or at least what was left of Max. His fur was patchy, his body thin and stretched. His eyes were gone, and his mouth, it was still smiling. You shouldn't have brought me back, Owen. Owen took a step back. His throat was dry, his pulse hammering. I just wanted you back. I just wanted... Max's body twitched. The thing inside him laughed. I know. Then, Max's skin started peeling away. Owen's stomach lurched. Something was underneath it. Something worse. And it was crawling out. The final truth. Owen wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers surrounded him. The air split apart. And then, something spoke from the dark. Not Max. Not the thing wearing his skin. Something older. Something waiting. You brought me back. The ground split open, and Owen screamed.